you're sending, like, you have spent 16, 17 years basically making sure your child is safe, and not just safe physically, but you're just making everything so comfortable for them. And then suddenly it's like, okay, I'm going to send you, thousands of miles away, and you go figure it out. Challenges are much.
The challenges are multiplied. Yeah,
Yes,
the challenges are
exactly.
multiplied.
Yes, everything from, from navigating sort of like your living condition to, because I think our hostels in India are still much more comfortable, and obviously more familiar, right? Than, going somewhere far away, having to deal with things on your own. The ideal time to start researching and planning is really somewhere in 11th grade, right? The actual nitty gritty applications towards the end of 11th grade, definitely right before your summer break, because the summer is a great time to actually get a good head start on a lot of the application components.
Hi, I am Sashwati Sarkar, and you're watching The Times of India. From students faking perfection on essays to picking majors they don't even like, how real is the race to study abroad getting? Today, we decode everything from application burnout to digital footprint detox and whether or not Indian schools are really preparing students for global classrooms. We're also bursting the myth that only top ranked colleges matter. Joining us today for this conversation is Ramya Madhukuri, College and Career Counselor at Sriram Academy and co founder of Guiding Teens, who has shaped hundreds of students find the right university, not just the famous one. Welcome to the show, Ramya.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Everyone is obsessed about rankings. You've often said that it should be fit over fame. Can you give us an example where a student has chosen a lower ranked college and still come out winning?
Sure. So there are two examples actually more recently from my students that I found very interesting. And I think when we talk about fit, it's multiple things. It's one, it's the different factors that go into fit typically tend to be, one is of course financial fit as well, because for many Indian families who are looking to send their children abroad, that is one that is a severe constraint. Beyond that, fit also encompasses things like your learning style, your ability to handle pressure, the kind of class environment that you seek, and also the kind of social environment you seek, and things like that, right? So these two examples, the first one is the student of mine who graduated from high school in 2020, and at the time he had. His eventual goal was to pursue medicine in the US, and he had two universities offers that were ranked between 20 and 30 in the US news rankings. One that was ranked in the 30s, and then a university that was ranked 100 plus, and it was actually what he called his safety school. And all four universities had strong, tracks to help support the medical school process for students. But he picked the fourth one mainly because one is, so there were about four factors that that were really a good fit for him. One was he got an entry into their honors program. So typically this means that he had opportunities for specific research at the undergrad level itself, which is still, fairly rare. There was some heavy mentoring. Then the second is because medical school in the US is a postgrad degree and it's a highly competitive process, the idea is also to stand out in your applications, to seek those opportunities at the undergrad level. And he felt that in a less competitive environment like this university, his chance to shine would be greater. And then the third was, of course, financial. There was a hefty merit scholarship with this university that wasn't present with the other ones. And that meant he spent in 4 years at this university what he would have spent in 1 year at some of these other universities. Um, yes, and this university had a preferential entry for their med school for their undergrad students who did undergrad from the same university. So, and then eventually now he has he has admission in at Harvard Medical School, and he really took advantage of everything the university had to offer. And the second example, if I can, is another student of mine. He graduated a year later in 2021, went to a university ranked 121st at that. I think today, I don't remember at that time what the rankings were, but I think in that case, he picked it because specifically they were very good for that one program that he really wanted. I mean, this university is known as somewhat of a feeder school into like the US aeronautics space, and that's really what he was interested in. And throughout his time at this university, he made sure that he, found opportunities for internships. He joined a couple of clubs that had to do with rocketry and aerospace, and then, of course, he shifted gears a little bit and went more into sort of autonomous vehicles and things like that. But he made sure that almost every year he had internships that were somewhere between 3 and 6 months long, and through these he really built up his profile very strongly. And then he also did some research with professors. Basically, the point is he made the best of the opportunities that were available to him. And for his masters now, he's going to be joining Cornell in the fall. So these are two examples, and these are still very young kids still who are it's still at the start of their careers. But I would say, I mean, there are so many examples of successful entrepreneurs, business people, artists, engineers who did not go to top ranked universities, right? If I could call the viewers' attention to two resources that I really love, one is this excellent book by Frank Brunei, who's a New York Times journalist, called Where You Go Is Not Who You Will Be, which cites a lot of these examples. And the second is this really interesting lecture by Malcolm Gladwell called Why You Shouldn't Go to Harvard, where he draws upon research and statistics to show that. Yeah, it's a very sort of like clickbaity topic, but he actually draws on a lot of research and statistics to show that top performing students at even very low ranked universities are better off than low performing students at the top universities. And this is really backed by a lot of research. And it's really very interesting to see. And I
It's
think
a very
students should.
interesting topic to even discuss. We should start a discourse. I think regarding this, what is better for you to be a low-ranking student in a top university or a top-ranking student in a low-ranked university? What should you? What will be better for you? So this
Yeah,
is a
it can be a
discourse.
whole topic of discussion by
Yeah,
itself,
yeah.
isn't it?
It's a separate episode altogether. It's a very pertinent point that you have raised, Ramya. Thank you for raising this.
Thank you. I think so much of what we do is trying to help people see beyond all the glitz and glamour of, what gets posted on social media or even in traditional media. And I think even rankings itself can be a whole topic of discussion, right? Because there's so much that goes into it that students may or may not understand. They say prestige, which is they equate it to rankings. But if you look into the rankings methodology, there's again some of it is like a self-fulfilling loop, right? The QS, I mean, not to like pick on any one rankings, but QS University places 40% weightage on peer reputation. Now, if you really think about it, that becomes a self-sustaining thing, right? Like if you're a dean at a certain university that's ranked, 500th, and you get a survey saying which of these universities have you heard of, you've obviously heard of universities that are in the top 20 or 30 in the rankings, and therefore you rate them higher. And if that's carrying 40% of weightage, the next year the same universities are going to keep appearing in the top 50, right? Like, so
Another
it's
pertinent point. Yes, we go very gaga on these rankings, but without hardly actually reviewing the parameters that they rank universities on. We don't, in the media houses, we do not go deep into the parameters and the methodology of choosing the best ranked ones. So that's something that needs to be
correct.
reviewed critically. I believe so. Yeah,
Correct.
very important
Absolutely.
points. Yeah. Yeah, so Ramya, students are required to build very shiny CVs, like, Olympiads, internships, leadership badges. Well, these are very important. These are not only very important; these are core essentials, I must say. But do you think universities, you know, do not only look into these? They want to, they see through all that noise. And what is it that they want to actually look at while choosing or while evaluating an international applicant?
Sure. So, One is it depends on the region a little bit, right? So, not every region places the same emphasis on extracurricular activities. And even those that do, they look at it a little. It varies from region to region. So, if you take the two most prominent regions that do look very heavily at extracurriculars, would be the US and UK. And these are, you can almost think of these as two sort of, philosophical ways of looking at extracurriculars. And much of the rest of the world either falls, it falls into one of these two buckets.
But I
So,
think comparing between UK and US, UK is more hung up on or focused on the core academics than extracurriculars, right?
yes, so they look at something called supercurriculars. They call it supercurriculars, which are basically subject-related extracurriculars. If I may just step back, so the U.S. looks at extracurriculars it's basically more about. Okay, so it goes back to the educational philosophy, right? Within in the US, there's a lot of flexibility to change your mind once you go in. Even if you apply for a degree in economics, while you're there, typically, you do declare your major somewhere in the second year, and so within that first 1 to 1.5 years, you have a lot of flexibility to change your mind. Whereas in the UK, much like the traditional Indian system, and now that is changing with NEP. But you are committing, you're applying to one degree, one major, and you're committing to that for 3 or 4 years. So with the UK, they basically want to make sure that you understand that this is what you want to study for 3 years or 4 years, and that you have really engaged with that subject beyond the classroom, that you're able to think of it in an insightful way. So for things like social sciences or humanities, they look for things like insight, deeper, extended reading, maybe some research work. So it's really about deeper engagement with the subject. And for things like engineering, it can be just more insightful reading, but it can also be hands-on application of what you've studied at school, right? Because engineering really is the application of science to practical life, and so they look for evidence of that. The US, on the other hand, because there is this flexibility to to basically choose anything or to change your mind when you're at university, um, they look more for things like basically they're looking for what are you signaling through your activities, right? So one is the flexible educational philosophy, and the second is it's important to remember that US universities really place a lot of emphasis on learning is not just relegated to the classroom, but the idea is that you learn as much from outside the classroom, from your peers, from the community, as you do within the classroom. So they're looking for evidence of, and for that potential and that promise of who you will be at university, right? Are you the kind of student who will come, who will contribute to the classroom? Are you the kind of student who will engage in student life, and therefore be a part of somebody else's learning journey as well? So they're looking for these signals, right? So some of the things that they look for are, it's mainly look at the qualities. So leadership, impact, empathy, intellectual curiosity, motivation, generosity, empathy, and things like that, right? So that's what they look for. It's more that what are you signaling through the activities. And then if you take the rest of the world, it's really, there are the new age Indian liberal arts universities, they fall into the sort of US camp where they're looking at broader signals, because again, they offer that flexibility of changing your mind once you're at university. Whereas places like Singapore definitely are looking at more academic focused activities. But in general, I think the more measurable and objective the activity is, the more credible it is for universities, right? That's somewhere how they cut through that noise as well, because these days, with the increase in number of consultants or even school-based counselors, a lot of students are really well prepared, and so a lot of them have activities in school or outside of school. So then it's not just about signaling these qualities. At highly selective universities, it also becomes a point of differentiation, and that's where the more objective metrics that are better. So things like Olympiads, ultimately, if you are at an international level Olympiad, or if you're on Team India at the World Schools Debating Championship, I mean, that puts you head and shoulders above rest of the applicants, right? So it's these different levels. I hope that answers the question somewhat. It's
Right.
a really nuanced topic, right? So it's hard to sometimes give these quick answers to these.
No, no, you can take all the time to be as elaborate as you can. That's not a problem. Yeah. So that takes us to our next question. You've worked with both schools and edtechs, Ramya. Do you think Indian schools are over preparing or under preparing their students for global admissions?
So it's such a great question, right? Especially because I was a school-based counselor for about 7 years, and now I still consult with schools, but I also work with students separately. I think, at least in my worldview, preparation falls into three broad categories, right? There's academic preparation, there is skills-based preparation, and then there's the social emotional preparation. In terms of academics, by and large, I do feel like our national boards and the international boards that are coming up in India, they all do a really good job. Really, there are nuances, there are some differences. My colleague and I have presented at international conferences about the differences between these boards, and I think by and large, all of them prepared them pretty well. Um, with I think the second and third bucket is where we can be doing better. So when you look at skills, right, and this is something that gets talked about a lot in our circles about the future skills, and the World Economic Forum does this pretty nice chart every year based on what employers are looking at. And even there, if you look at the categories of skills, there are the cognitive skills like analytical thinking, which I think, much of the curriculum imparts. Any of the curricula you take, in India, they do a pretty good job of cultivating that analytical thinking. But creative thinking is where even sometimes our curriculums can fall a little short of. It's not always, not every curriculum encourages students to think creatively. Often it's just about, even where things are application based questions, it often doesn't draw upon too many different disciplines. It's really like relegated to those topics, right? So I think even as schools, that is something we can be doing better off, right? Creative thinking, problem solving. um, Digital addiction does not help. Kids these days are so, one of the things I like saying is, in order to become a problem solver, you need to actually become a problem identifier first. But if your nose is always stuck in your phone, where are you observing these problems? Right in your backyard. It's really, kids will be like, oh, I don't know. Now there are companies that charge you lakhs of rupees to help you do social impact projects. We're living in India. You can't trip over a stone without hitting a social problem. I feel like there's so much opportunity and so much potential for students to do, but you have to open your eyes and observe those first, right? So, and that's where I feel, giving them that space to identify problems and to then use their creative thinking to make and empathy, right, to make a difference. Those kind of skills can be nurtured a bit better, I think, in all our schools. And then there's the social emotional one, and that I think has less to do with schools, but I mean, at the risk of, it's not exactly controversial. Everybody talks about it, but I do feel, our generation of parents, and I speak of this as a parent to three teens myself. I think we. And this depends on the segment. I mean, the kind of kids I work with are definitely, of a more privileged lot in general. But I do feel like, we do helicopter them, right? I feel like we're not letting them fail enough. The way when we look at, the way I grew up, it was very sort of, parents were very hands off. You were free to make your own mistakes and you learned from it and you picked up. And because you were given that freedom, right? And I think that's something we are not doing enough of with our kids. And you can't really blame schools for that. A lot of it has to happen. Parents have to do more of it, right? So I think these are some ways, because especially when you look at study abroad, you're sending, like, you have spent 16, 17 years, basically making sure your child is safe, and not just safe physically, but you're just making everything so comfortable for them. And then suddenly it's like, okay, I'm going to send you, thousands of miles away, and you go figure it out. And then we do see, unfortunately, that a lot of kids have trouble, then adjusting to that aspect of it, where they suddenly have to be independent, they have to figure out these things for themselves while dealing with the pressure of academics at a university level. So I feel like that resilience building we should be doing a better job of.
So, while I agree with you, a lot of this has to happen at home, but SEL, social emotional learning, that is very important while for students who aim to go abroad. Like, it's important for everybody, but it's more
Yes.
so for those who are going out of the comfort zone of their home, and you know are compelled to adapt to a new culture, a new a new society. So SEL, social emotional learning, that is also not very evolved in the school curricula of Indian boards, or maybe even, I don't know whether international boards, I mean, how much importance they place around SEL. But that's very important, right? Especially in the context of global education.
Absolutely. And I think, the schools are trying, because I think even the national boards are now being more cognizant of the need for it. So there's definitely an effort to build in more of it. But yes, and I don't think it's a national versus international board thing. From what I've seen, it's more, how seriously the school takes it. At this point, I've been lucky enough to work with at least 4 or 5 schools pretty, deeply. And I think it really still varies from school to school. Some of them just, take a more mindful and more intentional approach to it. But you're right. I think on so many levels, right? For a student going abroad, the challenges are much.
The challenges are multiplied. Yeah,
Yes,
the challenges are
exactly.
multiplied.
Yes, everything from, navigating sort of like your living condition to, because I think our hostels in India are still much more comfortable, and obviously more familiar, right? Than, going somewhere far away, having to deal with things on your own. And then also, dealing with people from very different cultures from your own. I think that itself is such a tricky thing to navigate, as a young adult.
Right. So now let's shift our focus to the recent developments on the global education front. So now F1 visa, with F1 visa now asking for social media handles, how should a student clean up their digital footprint without sounding fake?
So I think I love that, when we were discussing this earlier, so much of this revolved around just generally being authentic, right? Everywhere in life. And I think the same holds true for social media. I think and I speak of this as a US citizen and someone who's actually benefited from being in that country for almost 2 decades, right? I think it's not an unfair ask for a government to say, okay, if you're coming to our country to study, you really need to not be saying anything against the country. And that almost seems like common sense. And so I think when you look at your digital media, one is, I mean, students do have a tendency, it is that age when you're young, you're idealistic, you
And
feel
your blood is
that.
boiling.
Exactly, right? And of course, by the time you hit my age and you're middle aged, it tones down
My
the
age too.
reality
Yeah,
of.
yeah, yeah.
I didn't want to presume, but so I think, the fundamental thing is when you look through your social media, especially if you're somebody who has a view on a lot of different things, on politics, on, different social issues. Basically, I would say, and ask two things. One is this, especially if you're planning to go study in a place like the US, is this really sounding in any way at all, either sort of negative of the country, or critical of, the government or its handling of things. And sure, you're allowed to have an opinion, but then you really have to think, does every opinion need to be stated so publicly? I think the basic thing is you do need to be careful what you say on social media, right? Authenticity doesn't mean, I mean, you don't have to go out of your way to, if you really feel very strongly about it. There are ways to express these things that are, that are a bit more polished than, you know than being very blatant about it. I think it's a hard question to answer, to be honest. And I think you really have to, if you're a student who wants to go study in the US, and yet you feel like you're being so critical of the US government, you need to really
Rethink
think
your
about whether.
statement.
Exactly, right. Sorry. I mean, I don't even know what's a politically correct way to say all this, but I think that's really what it boils down to. Like, what is more important to you, right? So yeah, that's really it. I mean, we generally, honestly, I think what we're telling kids is, in general, be very, very circumspect about what you post on social media, whether that is, whether that's about the US or your own country. I mean, I think these are slightly difficult times, in general, to be very vociferous about different topics, right?
Right.
And you, as a journalist, will have a better opinion on this. I mean, I really don't know. I think you just have
No,
to be
here I'm on
careful.
the other side of the table. I'm the one who is asking
Yes, of
the
course. I
political
mean, that's why
questions,
you are. That's why you're a journalist, right? I think that's, yeah, makes
right? Yeah.
sense.
So, Ramya, so let's come to a more technical part of it now, from the recent developments, which are very sensitive to comment on in the current geopolitical situations. So, from we now focus on the application part of it, of studying abroad. So, from UCAS to Common App, country-specific portals, how do students avoid drowning in the application load overload? Can you suggest any hack to simplify the maze?
Sure. I think the first is to start early, right? I think when your applications for studying abroad for US, UK, and all, your first round of applications, especially if you're applying to Oxford, Cambridge, and stuff, will be due in middle of October of your 12th grade. So the ideal time to start researching and planning is really somewhere in 11th grade, right? The actual nitty gritty applications towards the end of 11th grade, definitely right before your summer break, because the summer is a great time to actually get a good head start on a lot of the application components. So the first is to do a research. If you're old fashioned like me, do a spreadsheet, right? Simple things. What are your universities? What are the requirements of each university? What all do you need to submit from your side? What is needed to be submitted from the school side, the application deadlines, the scholarship deadlines, which are different from the application deadlines sometimes, and then any extra tests you need to take. For example, Oxford, Cambridge, and a lot of UK medicine, so on, they have specific tests that happen in October, that you need to take, and you need to register for those. So anything that's a deadline, I mean, have a really, really good sense of your requirements and the portals and the links. These days with AI, I think you really can beautifully leverage, ChatGPT or Perplexity or any of these LLMs to basically, to make your life more efficient, right? So what you do is you can either ask the engine to seek out the deadlines, but I would still say it does tend to leave out things and hallucinate. So for the primary research, this is important enough that, roll up your sleeves and go to the websites and see what the requirements are. But once you have those, you can use AI to look for commonalities and also to come up with a schedule for you. So if you say, okay, look, these are 5 regions I'm applying to, go find the deadlines for these universities and the requirements, and then create a calendar whereby I'm applying to each of the regions at least two, or each of the universities at least 2 weeks in advance. And then based on that, you can give it so many parameters. You can say, okay, on average, it'll take me X number of weeks or days to create each application. Based on this, come up with an entire calendar for me for the next 6 months. And actually, it does a halfway decent job, which, of course, then don't take it as, God's word. Like, go through it, double check all the requirements, make sure you've captured all of it. So, but we're living in this amazing time of, I mean, of AI, right, to make your life more efficient. And I think that's what it is. Start early, have a good sense of your own of all the deadlines and requirements, and then use AI to build yourself a calendar and a schedule in such a way that, and you can give it additional constraints, right? You can plug in your school's exam dates, your summer vacation dates, your like Dasara break dates, or whatever it is, and say, look, based on all of this, create a calendar for me, and then see if that works for you. Make tweaks to it, get the help of a parent or a teacher or a counselor, and that's the way to. It's all about planning. There's no rocket science to this, right? I work with students who routinely apply to at least, I mean, some of them are very clear, they'll say just one region, but for many of them these days, I mean, India remains, and not just a backup. I mean, given everything that's going on in different parts of the world with international students, I think that it's definitely, even students looking abroad, it's India plus, right? Or US plus India or whatever. And that's minimum of two regions, but then they'll add on like a UK or a Singapore or, somewhere else in Europe. And so it really is about making sure you understand all the different deadlines, and then the time required for the preparation, and really planning and starting early. There is no secret to it. Like, there's no secret sauce. That is the secret sauce: planning and starting early.
So you were talking about AI, using AI in an intelligent way, right? But in this age of AI, you know, uh, admissions officers find it challenging to, have a very genuine, original, and authentic application, or sometimes SOPs, or sometimes these the story, the original story. I mean, many of it is AI driven now. So that becomes a challenge for admissions officers as well to, kind of go through those huge number of applications and figure out behind the polished language where the real person is. So if we are encouraging students to use AI, what are the guardrails that we should, you know, advise them on?
Yeah, it's something that we've. I mean, if you step back, not just applications, right? I mean, if you've looked recently at LinkedIn, everybody is writing excellent, polished prose, and that somewhere, I feel like it actually makes things a little less interesting, because you feel like you're finding the same sort of writing over and over again in different people's posts. So. Uh, with admissions officers, it's the same thing. I mean, they read, and many of them have been working for, like, 5, 10, 20 years in the same space. I was fortunate enough to have the experience of being a seasonal admissions reader for two very selective US universities in the last few years, and so as a result of that, I read a number of applications. We had a certain limit every week that we needed to hit, and even with my limited experience, it got to a point, after the second month, where I could tell, right, what was clearly something that was over kind of over reviewed and over engineered and things like that, versus what is something that's coming genuinely from the student. And that's me with my limited experience reading applications. Admissions officers have been reading these for years, and so they really can spot that, that authenticity in the application. It's actually, funnily, I would say, authenticity stands out a lot more in this space, because there is such a self-selection bias, for study abroad, in terms of going to these very renowned consultants and counselors. I feel like more students sound like each other than don't. So if you're a student, really aim to do your own work and be authentic. It's your voice definitely will stand out. Trust me on this. So
No,
a
any
few things.
guardrail while using AI, while we cannot,
Yeah,
we
yeah.
should be
So
discouraging
sorry,
students
I
to
got a little
use.
sidetracked with that. Yes. So generally, we say, what I found is, one is, use it as a brainstorming tool, right? So when you're thinking of what to write your essay on, it can be a really good buddy to sort of brainstorm different topics. So in that way, it's good. don't use it to write the core of your of your essays, because that's where I think the pitfall is. Many kids will say, okay, you know what, you create a first draft and let me tweak it. No, do the other way around. You write the essay to as much of an extent as possible, and then if you want, see where you can use, and this is totally allowed, right? So US universities do plenty of information sessions. Students who are applying for these, you should attend these, because they address this topic. This comes up quite a lot in the last couple of years. And the use of AI itself is not prohibited, but it's mainly around how do you use it, right? So don't use it to spit out even the first draft of your essay. You create the essay, get it to a good point, and then use it as a way to to sort of review the essay or to finesse it, right? But even that, you do really have to be careful, because remember, AI is, it's just sort of as I think kids also know these days, right? It is just rehashing a lot of what is already out there. So if you want to stand, and if you want your essay to sound authentic, don't allow it to over edit it. Don't allow anybody to over edit your essay, right? But that's where with AI, I would say, use it as a tool to tweak and finesse, but not to write the original one. And there are special, I mean, now if you look online, there are a lot of, even there are startups that are coming up that have specific sort of like AI based tools that help you review, or they will review the essay and not edit it, but give you pointers on how you can make it better. So those are good ways to use it as well for the essay
Right.
writing.
So, Ramya, there's a growing trend of students choosing alternative majors just to boost admission chances. Is it a strategic move or a short sighted one?
I personally think it's terrible. It's terrible advice, and I know it's people do it, and I know there are some like prominent counselors and consultants out there who think it's fine, but in my opinion, I think it's terrible advice for three reasons. Right, one is, you spend, in order to apply for an alternative major, you do have to spend time building your profile that shows interest in that major, right? Which means now you're spending anywhere between 2 or 4 years, your sort of these lovely wonderful teen years where you're supposed to be exploring your interests. You're spending that doing something that you may not necessarily like, right? Let's assume maybe you do like it. Maybe literature is something that really is interesting to you. Maybe maybe you want to major in economics, but you were told that literature is easier for an Indian student to get into, so you're spending your time building your profile in that, and you like literature. That may still be okay. But the second reason why there's a terrible advice is, you are then, it is coming with an opportunity cost, right? To really explore that thing that you feel that you want to study. So if you want to study economics, but it's a very, very competitive course at most universities, by building your profile for something else, you're really wasting this opportunity to explore whether economics is what you want to study, whether this is, whether, and how deep you want to go into it. It is a missed opportunity to build skills in this subject, to do deeper reading, to set yourself up well for excelling at university, or even for internships and things like that, right? So CS is such a sought after course, and I think sometimes kids will say, okay, maybe I can apply for something like applied math or math instead. And sure, while you're building your skills in math, if you want to not just do well in CS at university, but also set yourself up well to get those internships and job placements, throughout university, then you need to start building that expertise and that skill set now. And so you're wasting this time by doing something else, right? In search of this alternative major. And why? To get into a university that, again, this goes back to rankings, because you feel you're obsessed with a certain ranked university. That's really the reason why all this gets done. And the third thing, I think, is a sort of deeper level philosophical thing. It feels so inauthentic and fake to do this, right? And is this kind of how you want to approach So the third reason is really, and this is what I tell kids, sometimes they'll say, oh, and they'll outright, kids are so amazing that way. They will say, oh, ma'am, but, so many universities don't necessarily ask you for, evidence of this. And there is a lot of to be honest, there is enough fakery in this space. So, but the question is really, this is not about appeasing somebody else. This is not about faking your way into a university. It is the start of your life as an adult. It's the start of your career. And so what kind of person do you want to be, right? Do you want to be inauthentic, or do you want to live your life authentically? So for me, this alternative major thing is, it in most cases it doesn't make sense. If there are closely allied majors, then yes, I mean, you're still deciding, so there's no reason not to do that. But overall, I would say apply for what you want to study, right? Not something that you think has a better chance of getting you into Harvard.
So, we were talking a while ago about authenticity. But let's face it, students are coached to sound impressive these days. What's that line between authentic and over engineered?
Yeah, so I think we talked about some of this in, when we're talking about AI too, but the same holds true for your application. I would say, the advice is really to start with your values. So think about, because especially when we look at US applications, where the authenticity really comes through, and where it's important discussion to have is, one is in the profile building, like we've been talking about, right? It's not just about what do I think, Stanford wants to see, and then try to reverse engineer the whole process. But it's more about what genuinely interests you, and doing those activities, and then coming to 12th grade and seeing, okay, what all have I done given this profile and what it looks like, what kind of universities would be a good fit for me. Because then it becomes more obvious that the kind of activities that you have naturally been attracted to will say something pretty strong about who you are, right? And that it's as much, profile building is as much a self discovery journey as it is, a profile building journey, right? It's not just about what gets put on your CV or resume. It's also about discovering yourself through those 4 years of doing these activities. So authenticity shows up, in the activities you do, in how you have, in what kind of things you have been doing, and what that says about your values. And the second place in the application where authenticity shows up is, of course, your essays. And that again, we talked about this with AI, but the same is true for, even if you weren't using AI. The idea is to say, what are my values? Are they coming across in my essays? Are these values also coming across in other aspects of the application, like my teacher letters of recommendation and things like that, right? And so self reflection is important. I think for authenticity, you need to understand what your values are. Otherwise, you won't be able to project them anyway in your application. The second is do your own work, right? I think write your own essays, as we said already. You as a student have a unique voice and a lived experience that is entirely yours and yours alone. So don't let someone else tell your story, right? Tell your own story. Then, in terms of the more sort of tangible things, also don't have too many people review your essays and things like that. Take one or two trusted people and work with them, because it is such a subjective area that everybody will have an opinion on it, right? We're all great at having opinions on everything. And so, if the same essay, somebody will say, oh, it's so great, and somebody else. And even if, by the way, you take two admissions officers, it's so funny because once there were these two admissions officers who had done an essay session, and one of them said, she said, oh, I'm not big on these philosophical things. Like, I prefer like straightforward essays. And the other one turned around and said, oh, I actually don't mind. I like, like dealing with those abstract topics and stuff. So you can't please everyone. So if you're the kind of kid who is, more of a straightforward, straight shooting kid, be that. If you genuinely love discussing abstract things, be that, right? And then you have to know that that is part of the fit as well. So a university which doesn't value abstract thinking will reject you, but that's okay, because you don't want to go to university like that if you're an abstract thinker, right? Then I think this is advice that many US universities will give you, especially for your essays. It's called the name drop test, right? So what you do is, if you basically take 3 4 of your classmates or friends and put their name in the application or in your essay and see if it still works. If it does, you're doing it wrong, because then it's too generic and it's not specific to you. An essay that talks about you should be unique to you, right? If I can take somebody else's name and the essay still works fine for them, for my friend XYZ, then that is not being specific enough. So these are some ways in which authenticity shows up in your application. um, and that would be my advice, to stay authentic, right? It's actually not that hard. Just take charge of your own stuff. It's as simple as that, really. Don't let
And you
other
need a little bit
people.
of luck as well. You need a little bit of
Oh, you
luck
need
as
a.
well.
Yeah, and not just luck. I think it's also with US, because it is a holistic process and because it is a very opaque process, which is frustrating. It even and they have so many. I mean, especially I would urge students to read a few books on this. Right, there are some wonderful books on the application, how all of this works. So if you see, US universities have institutional priorities for any given year. They also are trying to balance diversity. They're trying to balance students with different interests. And so, only so much of it is in your control. You may be an amazing student. You may even fit the bill. I mean, if you look at these documents from Harvard's many court cases, where they talk about, you get a really deep insight into, how their application process works. They could take in, even the qualified students, they could take in 4 times as many students as they do today, and all those kids will thrive at Harvard. But they can't, because the seats are limited, and within that they're trying to balance different things and build this whole diverse, well-rounded class. And so it is really, it's a huge factor of luck, actually. Not just luck. I mean, luck sounds so arbitrary, but it's a lot of factors beyond the student's control. So it's not a
Right.
reflection on you if you're not getting into highly selective US university, because you are still amazing. Please remember that.
Right. That's a very important message for all the viewers, all study abroad aspirants. Very, very important and strong message. So there's another very important and crucial topic that we hardly talk about. That is academic cultural shock. You know, what, according to you, should Indian students know before walking into the seminar room of a US or a UK college?
So, in general, I would say, so I listed on 5 that came to mind, but of course, I'm sure there are many. And this is as somebody, who I studied, did my master's in the US as well. And definitely there are differences, right? So, one is, I would say, don't expect to be spoon fed when you're at school. And this is, I often have students who, every year I have a couple of students who move from India to the US somewhere during high school. And even the high schools there do this a little differently, where they prepare their students, in this particular aspect, they prepare them better for university. In India, even in international schools, there is a tendency to just sort of, the teacher comes, they explain the concept, and then there's, of course, there's discussion and Q&A and all that stuff. But it starts with the teacher imparting that knowledge, right? And I think that's where the biggest difference with university life would be, is that there is pre-reading, and then the classroom discussion is meant to enhance and deepen the understanding, not starting with what is inflation, like not some basic concept that's explained to you. So don't expect to be spoon fed in class, right, academically. So when there is pre-reading, take it seriously, because coming to class without having done your reading and stuff is just going to get really frustrating, and you'll soon find it that you're over your sort of head above, you're sort of struggling with this, right? The second is be willing to participate in class, and I think this is something, I think Indian schools are being better about this, but the systems there, especially like you said, in some of these smaller classrooms which are seminar style, you are expected to have done your work, you're expected to have an opinion, you're expected to come with questions, insights, things like that. So you have to get comfortable participating in class. The third is, no one's going to chase you to meet your deadlines. You have to be responsible for your own work. And this, I think, especially what we see is, there's so many kids who take tuitions for every subject, or parents are constantly sort of like behind them to do their work, to meet their, to study for exams. Nobody is going to be doing any of that at university. And there's not just study abroad. Even you go to US, Indian universities, nobody is chasing you, right, to do your work. This is something that is a hard reality. You have to become self-regulating on that front. The fourth is be proactive. So all universities, Indian, foreign, but especially US universities, they have an amazing number of resources, right? Everything from student clubs to academic support to like research resources to incubators on campus, all sorts of things. But nobody is going to force you to go there. Nobody is going to, make sure you're doing it. So in order to have the best experience, the most productive experience, and this is something we explain, I had mentioned these two students of mine at the beginning who took advantage of all these opportunities. Universities do expect you to take advantage of the opportunities you're provided, and so you need to be proactive, right? You need to go and make sure that you understand what's out there. How do you get what you need, and go after it. And the last is, again, on a related topic, right? Learning happens, especially in US universities, it happens as much beyond the classroom as it does in the classroom. So, this is the time for you to really try out different activities, different clubs, and go beyond your comfort zone, right? So there is a tendency to also, of course, at the beginning, it can be a huge source of comfort to find other Indians and, just sort of stick with your own kind. And that's a thing. I mean, I think universities are aware of that too. They call it, I think, self-imposed segregation of sorts, right? But really, this is your golden opportunity. And one of the benefits of studying abroad is that you are exposed to this huge, multiculturalism, right? So you have kids from everywhere, and I think, it really makes you, it's really eye opening. It's one of the things I appreciated the most from my master's experience was that, just meeting people from like South America, from like other parts of Asia, from Africa, and their lived experiences are so different from your own. It just makes you, I think it just makes you an overall more like tolerant, a better and more sort of cultured human being. So those are the few things. I think proactive is the main thing, really.
And that brings us to the final question of this very slightly philosophical and very inward moving interview, I would say, because we have tried to probe into the minds of, this generation, which is, seeking, global education. So, the final question is, if you had to write a one line survival guide for Indian students heading abroad in 2025, what would it be?
So I think it's a reiteration of everything we've been speaking about, but basically I would say, and this sounds harsh, but it's the reality, don't expect things to be handed to you. You need to work hard, and really hustle seems to be the keyword when I speak to my students who are now at university or beyond after having studied abroad. You have to hustle to seek opportunities, especially for internships and careers. So that would be the advice. Don't expect anything to be handed to you.
Thank you, Ramya. Thanks a lot for your inputs and your time.